Cell membrane. Cell membrane is a protective sheath, enveloping the cell body. It is also known as plasma membrane or plasma lemma. This membrane separates the fluid outside the cell called extracellular fluid, ECF, and the fluid inside the cell called intracellular fluid, ICF. The cell membrane is a semi-permeable membrane. So, there is free exchange of certain substances between ECF and ICF. Thickness of the cell membrane varies from 75 to 111 A. Composition of cell membrane. Cell membrane is composed of three types of substances. 1. Proteins 55%. 2. Lipids 40%. 3. Carbohydrates 5%. Structure of cell membrane. On the basis of structure, cell membrane is called a unit membrane or a three-layered membrane. The electron microscopic study reveals three layers of cell membrane. Namely, one central electron-lucent layer and two electron-dense layers. The two electron-dense layers are placed one on either side of the central layer. The central layer is a lipid layer formed by lipid substances. The other two layers are protein layers formed by proteins. Cell membrane contains some carbohydrate molecules. Also, structural model of the cell membrane. 1. Danieli-Davson model. Danieli-Davson model was the first proposed basic model of membrane structure. It was proposed by James F. Danieli and Hugh Davson in 1935. And it was accepted by scientists for many years. This model was basically a sandwich of lipids covered by proteins on both sides. 2. Unit membrane model. In 1957, J.D. Robertson replaced Danieli-Davson model by unit membrane model on the basis of electron microscopic studies. 3. Fluid mosaic model. S.J. Singer and G.L. Nicholson proposed the fluid mosaic model. According to them, the membrane is a fluid with mosaic of proteins. Mosaic means pattern formed by arrangement of different colored pieces of stone, tile, glass or other such materials. This model is accepted by the scientists till now. In this model, proteins are found to float in the lipid layer instead of forming the layers of the sandwich-type model. Lipid layers of the cell membrane. The central lipid layer is a bilayered structure. This is formed by a thin film of lipids. The characteristic feature of lipid layer is that it is fluid in nature and not a solid structure. So, the portions of the membrane move from one point to another point along the surface of the cell. The materials dissolved in lipid layer also move to all areas of the cell membrane. Major lipids are 1. Phospholipids. 2. Cholesterol. 1. Phospholipids. Phospholipids are the lipid substances containing phosphorus and fatty acids. Aminophospholipids, sphingomyelins, phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidyletolamine, phosphatidylglycerol, phosphatidylserine and phosphatidylacetyl are the phospholipids present in lipid layer of cell membrane. Phospholipid molecules are arranged in two layers. Each phospholipid molecule resembles the headed pin in shape. The outer part of the phospholipid molecule is called the head portion and the inner portion is called the tail portion. Head portion is the polar end and it is soluble in water and has strong affinity for water, hydrophilic. Tail portion is the nonpolar end. It is insoluble in water and repelled by water, hydrophobic. Two layers of phospholipids are arranged in such a way that the hydrophobic tail portions meet in the center of the membrane. Hydrophilic head portions of outer layer face the ECF and those of the inner layer face ICF, cytoplasm. 2. Cholesterol. Cholesterol molecules are arranged in between the phospholipid molecules. Phospholipids are soft and oily structures and cholesterol helps to pack the phospholipids in the membrane. So, cholesterol is responsible for the structural integrity of lipid layer of the cell membrane. Functions of lipid layer in cell membrane. Lipid layer of the cell membrane is a semi-permeable membrane and allows only the fat-soluble substances to pass through it. Thus, the fat-soluble substances like oxygen, carbon dioxide and alcohol can pass through his lipid layer. The water-soluble substances such as glucose, urea and electrolytes cannot pass through this layer. Protein layers of the cell membrane. Protein layers of the cell membrane are electron-dense layers. These layers cover the two surfaces of the central lipid layer. Protein layers give protection to the central lipid layer. The protein substances present in these layers are mostly glycoproteins. Protein molecules are classified into two categories. 1. Integral proteins are transmembrane proteins. 2. Peripheral proteins are peripheral membrane proteins. 1. Integral proteins. Integral or transmembrane proteins are the proteins that pass through entire thickness of cell membrane from one side to the other side. These proteins are tightly bound with the cell membrane. Examples of integral protein: I. Cell adhesion proteins. E. Cell junction proteins. E. Some carrier, transport proteins. IV. Channel proteins. V. Some hormone receptors. VI. Antigens. VII. Some enzymes. 2. Peripheral proteins. Peripheral proteins or peripheral membrane proteins are the proteins which are partially embedded in the outer and inner surfaces of the cell membrane and do not penetrate the cell membrane. Peripheral proteins are loosely bound with integral proteins, a lipid layer of cell membrane. So, these protein molecules dissociate readily from the cell membrane. Examples of peripheral proteins: I. Proteins of cytoskeleton. E. Some carrier, transport proteins. E. Some enzymes. Functions of proteins in cell membrane. 1. Integral proteins provide the structural integrity of the cell membrane. 2. Channel proteins help in the diffusion of water, soluble substances like glucose and electrolytes. 3. Carrier or transport proteins help in the transport of substances across the cell membrane by means of active or passive transport. 4. Pump. Some carrier proteins act as pumps by which ions are transported actively across the cell membrane. 5. Receptor proteins serve as the receptor sites for hormones and neurotransmitters. 6. Enzymes. Some of the protein molecules form the enzyme and control chemical, metabolic reactions within the cell membrane. 7. Antigens. Some proteins act as antigens and induce the process of antibody formation. 8. Cell adhesion molecules are the integral proteins are responsible for attachment of cells to the neighbors at a basal lamina. Carbohydrates off the cell membrane. Some of the carbohydrate molecules present in cell membrane are attached to proteins and form glycoproteins, proteoglycans. Some carbohydrate molecules are attached to lipids and form glycolipids. Carbohydrate molecules form a thin and loose covering over the entire surface of the cell membrane called glycocalyx. Functions of carbohydrates in cell membranes. 1. Carbohydrate molecules are negatively charged and do not permit the negatively charged substances to move in and out of the cell. 2. Glycocalyx from the neighboring cells helps in the tight fixation of cells with one another. 3. Some carbohydrate molecules function as the receptors for some hormones.